Hi, and welcome to our February edition of Just Ask Jen. We are here today and super excited about talking about money. We've got my colleague, Board Member Bolton, who is the chair of the Finance Committee, and we've got our treasurer, Jen Wagner, and we will be joined shortly by our superintendent. And we are just talking about doom, 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 the budget and money. So we're going to kind of move to our board member Bolton, who is the chair of our finance, to just talk about where we are in this, not in the process and the timeline, but just what's going on in the world of money regarding finance.
Thank you. Well, it's not always fun to talk about money, but right now, having had our treasurer's office in the district receive a few awards very recently and won 16 times in the last 16 years, we're proud to talk about our financial status and our financial team, and very proud to try to figure out how we can best deliver what we need as a board, which is the financial resources, get them and sustain them, and then, of course, through efforts by everyone in the district, distribute them in an equitable way. And we're in the midst of our budget process right now. And as we get through this budget process, the hope always is to be able to, and by law, unless we make special arrangements, need to pass a budget by June 30th. And the reality for us, too, is that you have all of your field operations, meaning your schools and other operations as well as all of your central office pieces that have to come together. So the budget is several chapters, if you will, of time, and parts of it get done at different times of this process. But it's basically a year, all things considered. And when you finish one, you're getting ready to start the next one, only taking a slight breather. But this year, a lot of different things are happening. We've, of course, ended what we call pooling, which is a very different way. We were very proud to be able to do that. Very few districts were allowed to do it. We also have, are in the midst of the first half of our strategic planning, and that impacts the budget. And more particularly, we have a tremendous amount of engagement through our schools with their budgets, and also had a great turnout last night about some issues regarding our budget. And so we're excited that everybody seems very engaged about the future and how we can best gather our money and spend our money in an equitable and also, shall we say, transparent way.
Well, I forgot. I got ahead of myself because we were talking about money. So I forgot to mention that we are on Blue Jeans and we are on Facebook. And if you have any questions for us, please, we've got some audience full of people that can help with moderating, and put your questions in the chat and we will be able to get them answered in 30-second real time. And so let's move into the nitty gritty, because we've actually got another mic here, don't we? So that we can all have one. So, Treasurer Wagner, money.
Yes. So, if Rob will bring up my PowerPoint and then just jump onto the first slide that's got the timeline. So, just want to agree that the budget is really a journey, and it's in the last 4 to 5 years, the journey has been very different. The process that we've been using to build the budget has been very different because of COVID, because of a prior strategic plan. The process hasn't been the same year after year after year, and so we're always tweaking and we're always refining with new information. And but in general, the process begins in October of each year, and it's based on the number of students that we take a picture, an extract, so to speak, of enrollment in all of our schools by school, by grade, and by condition of the student. Thank you. Superintendent Wright is now joining us. She's coming from another meeting, so we've been kind of talking to get her catch up. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. So back to, we do an extract of the number of students and by grade and by condition, and then we use that information to predict next year's enrollment. using a 3-year promotion retention experience. And historically, district-wide, it's about 98% accurate. School by school, it's not so accurate. But then we tweak it based on known things. So if housing development changes, a charter school opens up next door, closes down next door. Those kinds of individual feedback we get from the school. And then once the projections are finalized, and we do look at a 1-year window and then how it compares to a 3-year and a 10-year window. Excuse me. We feed that information into a series of staffing formulas that are built off of the collective bargaining agreements. We have 6 of them, and state and federal law and guidelines. And all those formulas are posted on the website that's on Board Docs. And if you go to what's the date of the workshop? We'll repost it for you. So you can, if you have questions about the formulas, you can look at that. But my intent today was to kind of walk through some of those formulas, but that would be like 85 slides and it'd take the entire hour, and there wouldn't be time for questions. So I really just want to talk process and then open it up for questions. And then we were going to have some clarity around a lot of the questions around title this year. This is the first time in 8 years that anybody's ever asked me any detailed questions about it. And because we came out of the pool, some of the rules have changed since the last time we were outside the pool, and we're in a different program. So we're hoping to provide a little bit of clarity about that. But so once the schools get their core staffing based on the formulas, then we do a series of reviews and appeals, and so they can justify certain need because of their program or a new information that we didn't know about. And then we do some equity analysis on staffing based on the academic needs and the board goals and guardrails, and how to address some of those academic needs using title dollars. Then the schools get their non-personnel per pupil allocation, so they go back to their school teams and try to decide how much money they're going to put towards field trips and instructional supplies. And we do a centralized allocation for classroom supplies, so teachers don't have to use their own money, and that will come later. But so the school budget's due back to us on March 10th, and the central office kicks off on March 13th. Then we will go through a series of review and balancing activities, because in the 30 years I've been doing this with the district, this is my 30th, I think, the budget ask is always greater than the budget target. The budget target is based on the 5-year forecast, and, in order to maintain enough cash balance from year to year to not have to go back to the public for new money. And so we have to be very careful about how we allow our expenses to grow, our budgets to grow. So we go through a series, and then in April, May, we do a lot of public presentations on here's the status, here are the challenges, these are our recommendations for balancing. Present the board to the budget in June to ask for an appropriation. Although because there's this strategic plan effort, and at least one board member who would like to slow that roll a little bit, we may be doing a 90-day temporary time to really balance and finalize a good budget, a balanced budget. So I'm going to pause right there and see if there's any questions, or does anybody want to add anything?
So I do want to ask a question, and I always try to come with a community lay people perspective. So you talked about polling. Board Member Bolton shared that polling has ended. We've come out of polling, and you mentioned polling, but what is that, so that we can understand where we were versus where we are now?
That's a great question. So under No Child Left Behind, so it used to be that we were not allowed to commingle our funds. So general fund pays for all the general expenses, operating expenses. Title I paid for students who are disadvantaged. IDEA paid for students with disabilities. And then Title IV or Title III is English language learners. I always get the numbers mixed up. But so every grant, you could only, it's safe and drug-free schools was Title IV. So you could only spend money on those things. They're very restrictive. And there was a lot of money that was left on the table at the end of the year. Because in Title I, you could only use the service, you can only spend the money that were on the Title I kids in the building, right? The whole school couldn't take advantage of it. Well, No Child Left Behind allowed us to commingle those funds into one fund. It's called the pool, the school-wide pool. And so once the money was in, so we put in the general fund, the first couple of years we put in the general fund, Title I, Title IIA, which is class size reduction, and IDEA B. once the money enters the pool, it loses its identity, so that you have to use that money to solve and address the student needs from your, we called it the one plan. So a student needs assessment happens. So if you had a weakness in math, then you had to use that money to help support your math weakness in order to drive student outcomes. So it gave us a lot more freedom on how to spend that money. We used the money more efficiently that way, because the principal only had to deal with one budget instead of 4 separate budgets. But the challenge at the tail end of that process was it made it harder to justify our equity and allocate equity funding based on the board policy, because it lost its identity in the fund. So we decided as a district out of the pool, and now we're struggling with, now we have to go back to the more restrictive rules, that things that you could spend under the pool, you can't do under title funds. And it's a transition. It's been really challenging for all of us to go back to that rule. And like one example is copy clicks. So while we were under the pool, a school could say, I need X amount of copy clicks. And for the public's purpose, that's every time you hit the copy or you make a page, a click. That's how we charge our budget. But now that you're out of the pool, you can't put copy clicks under Title I budget, because it's the general use of instruction that all children received. And so Title I has to be supplemental to what your general operating and instructional operations are. It has to be an add-on. So if it's a requirement and it's part of your normal day-to-day operations, Title I can't pay for that. That makes sense? So it makes it much harder on that end. So there's pros and cons to everything, but did I answer your question?
It does answer my question. I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Did we decide to come out of the pool as a district? We just said, hey, we don't want that. And you mentioned because of our equity policy. But then we have schools that come and say, hey, we want Title I status because we have a large growing population of students that are identifying under the auspices of title funding, and so why can't we be considered title? What would be the benefit of staying in the, like, why did we come out and then
so
we go back?
The decision to go in and out of the pool has nothing to do with how schools are participating. Okay. So the decision to come out of the pool was the previous board prior to the most recent ones. And it had a lot to do with the way how to handle and implement equity. So our intent was, and it was even prior to the current superintendent, right? So the intent was the general operations, the general fund should pay for the base services for every student receives: a teacher, a textbook, a desk. Title I, which was supposed to represent equity, because equity is an add-on to the specific needs, so they're targeted to those needs. And so we were trying to marry up, if you remember the old ice cream motif that Ms. Bolton doesn't like. It was the best way for me to understand, because I think in pictures. So the general fund was the cone. Title I was the first layer of ice cream, and then the next layer became other funds like career tech funds. And then the top layer become things like Idea B, which were very specific to individual students rather than groups of students or all students. And so we couldn't do that while we were in the pool, because you lose the identity. So that's why we went out of the pool. In terms of qualifying, several years ago, back in 2012-13, I think, we entered what was called the Community Eligibility Program, where we as a district could qualify a school as being 100% free and reduced lunch. So every child could have breakfast and lunch, regardless of whether they individually qualified for free and reduced lunch. So what's confusing is the data that's used, Feed Children, is updated more often than Ohio Department of Education updates the poverty percent in June of each year. And so the data that we're using now to build the fiscal year 24 budget was updated in June of 22. Okay. Now, once you qualify, your first year as a qualification, you are considered a targeted school, which means you have to rank your students based on their academic need, and you can only serve those students for that purpose. versus your second year and beyond, you become a school-wide school, different than the school-wide pool, but that means you can use your title funds to serve all kids in that school based on the academic needs and of the needs assessment. Does that make sense? So your first years are targeted while you plan how you're going to be a school-wide school. So for example, SCPA in fiscal year 24 will be their first year of qualifying for title funds, but they're a targeted school, so it's a different process for allocating the budget. So to allocate Title I funds, we take the money, so the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services certifies free and reduced lunch, direct certification. They take that data, enter it into the ODE website. The ODE website puts it into our application, a consolidated application. We call it a CCIP because we use acronyms for everything. But that's the data that we use to allocate title funds. So it's a year behind the community eligibility program. So they use the same data, is on a 4-year renewal cycle. We are in year 2 of year 4. So that means they freeze the data for 4 years unless you ask for it to be reopened. And there's a variety of conditions that student dining services use to do that. Once you open it and reset, you start your 4-year cycle all over again. Now, ODE will look at it annually. So for a school like Cairns and Fairview, who are close to that bubble, they will look at it in June of 23 and determine whether they can also participate as a targeted school for the next year. But it's not as rapidly as we would like things to change, and so, but we have to follow the practice. Now, the law says we serve any child or any school that's 75% or above. This district is using 40% and above for at least 10 years, but nobody knows how we got to the 40% because that all happened before our time. But we've been using that 40% for more than 10 years. So we go above it, well beyond what state law, federal law requires us to do. Did I miss anything, Superintendent?
I think that does cover it. A couple things that I would add. One, the way that we use Title I funds now, that's why it's important that we have a staff allocation process, because having a formula that gives you an allocation, also lets you know that when you are providing services that are over and beyond the base. So that's the first, so that everyone gets the same. And then when you talk about equity in terms of thinking about Title I, that is where you're saying these things are in addition because the school is a Title I school. The second, I do want to just punctuate a little bit the second part about identifying schools that are strategic schools. And essentially that's schools that are in their first year as a Title I school. And so generally when that happens, not only are you looking at your needs assessment, which is our one plan or our school improvement plan, to determine how you're working with students, you're also keeping some type of documentation that those are the only students that you were serving during that time. And so it changes what happens in terms of the allocation that schools get. So I think some of the schools, and I really think it's a dynamic conversation to have right now, because I've shared, I know in finance, and when we've talked about this before, that it is my first experience after working with Title I for 30 years that I've ever had a school that has wanted to be considered Title I. But the reason is because they see that they're servicing a population of students that need additional support. And so if there is a way for them to get that additional support, they're looking for additional funding to do it. And as we've been talking about additional funding for types of positions, what those support roles look like, and we've been connecting that to Title I, that's really helped people to identify, okay, there is truly something different about this process and about being able to share those resources. I think the third, and even though it was before my time in terms of moving from a Title I, moving from pool to more specificity, it was before my time in our district, but having lived Title I for many, many years, it is really the only way to guarantee that you are looking at numbers that are clean numbers. And when I say numbers, I'm talking about support that's provided in a clean way that is then able to be shared back. So it does have more restrictions, but the purpose of those restrictions are so that you truly can see how you're servicing students that are the ones eligible for the funding that we get. So if there's anything for me to call out here, it's that there is a difference in the qualification for CEP. CEP is about feeding students versus Title I and Title I allocations, and that's about additional financial resources.
So, and there's another nuance here that I wanted to mention, I forgot, was they allowed us to freeze our student counts to pre-COVID counts. So for October of 19. So for the last 2 years, we've been using October 19 enrollments to allocate monies up to the Title I schools, regardless of what their current enrollment is. This year, they made us go back to the old practice of using the October data as their enrolled data. So Title I is not based off of projected student. It's based off of the October data. You take that October number, multiply it times the percentage, and times the per pupil allocation. And there is a required set aside for parent engagement. And so their rules are just different. And it doesn't necessarily follow our current practice on how we project students, try to anticipate where there's going to be growth and need and stuff like that. And so it's an interesting conversation that maybe we can strategically think with our ODE partners about how to do things differently.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, good.
What are the biggest concerns and impacts to next year's budget?
I'm sorry, say that again.
What are the biggest concerns and impacts to next year's budget that will impact next year's budget?
I'd say the biggest, based on the feedback I'm getting, is when enrollment changes and resources have to reflect that, because we do not have an endless supply of funds. Our enrollment, while at preschool, has totally rebounded for pre-COVID numbers. Some of our other grades have not. And so that's reflecting some staffing changes that people are not necessarily happy with. Now, for the last several years, we've been able to use our ESSER funds to help maintain staffing so that, you remember when we first went into COVID, everybody around us was laying people off. They were closing businesses, closing universities, but we did not. We held on to all of our staff and we continued to pay them through ESSER. And so then the year that we went back into face-to-face learning, we held on to that staff members because we needed, learning loss, transition back into real face-to-face school in the classroom. And then last year, we actually held on to more. So we were a little bit overstaffed last year based on our formulas, based on enrollment, but we thought it was important to help the schools transition back to a normal way or a new way of living in the classroom. And so this year, we're going back to our core formulas, and that's painful. Those changes are painful.
I would concur. I think the additional piece that I see is one, how we begin to not just prepare for not having ESSER funds to make up the difference, but how we do that in a way that is transparent, and at the same time, it doesn't stifle the progress moving forward, and it doesn't stifle what we know we need to do to improve overall student outcomes. There is not a safe way to talk about changes with the budget. It doesn't matter where we talk about it. We have been very open and upfront. We've had conversations in finance about the way that we're looking at contracts and the way that we're looking at cross-referencing the just work that we've done in the past. And what I often say is everybody wants change until change shows up, because what that means is change everything else, but don't change anything that I'm doing. And so there is not a way for us to address some of the challenges that we have as we move into next year. For the most part, we are looking at making recommendations for ESSER that are those one-time things that we know we won't have the recurring funds to do. You know, there may be a pilot or something here or there that we would recommend to the board for approval, but that would be on the lower end of thinking about what it is that we're looking to do next. I think that's one. I think the second is beginning to help people think differently about how we utilize our funds at the school level, specifically to drive student achievement. Because that information is not necessarily as clear. We know that we have an allocation process that we use, or formulas that we use to determine how much staff we have, but there's a lot more that goes into really working to make sure that we're getting students what they need in the classroom. I also know that after Board Member Bolton speaks, that our treasurer also has the Title I presentation. I think that she was going to share as well. That's fine.
Yeah,
Yes.
we were
Yeah,
gonna
if there's
wing
time.
it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, I think everything that's been said is all of those are concerns and challenges for our budget coming up. I think I would add to that, and the superintendent won't be surprised at me saying this, I think a lot of it is how to organize the district in a way that we can maximize the capacity that we have in our facilities and also can concentrate enough of critical mass, if you will, of students in all of our buildings so that all of our students can have a comprehensive program. Because in order to offer all the programming that we are capable of offering, we have to have a certain number of students in every facility to indeed be able to staff it and make the programs happen. And we have right now, our preschools are very full and our high schools are quite full. And our elementaries, we have an opportunity to rethink many of our elementaries so that we can get a better balance among our elementaries so that we can offer and maximize programs. So I think it's finding that way. And then, of course, we have a couple of operational issues that have to be addressed, and we're committed to as it pertains to not just transportation, but also those sorts of things regarding safety and health concerns for our students.
And I just want to add, from a community standpoint, I've heard people are okay with changes. So I want to clarify that. I don't think that people don't want change. I think people want the transparency and they want some lead time. And I was using to this example, I was using what you shared about the nurses and how we are going to have to, that money is going to run out for the extra nurses that we've gotten. And I was sharing that with someone in a meeting today, and they were like, oh, wow, so we need to start planning now. That is exactly what we're talking about. And so to that point, I think that the community just needs the transparency, the data. They need to know what's coming down the pike, not in the moment, not in real time. They don't want to know next month, in 2 months, this is what's going to happen. I think that lead time of a year or whatever, in our planning is just appropriate. And I think that's really, I say, a common courtesy, because that really is kind of it. We need to give as much notification that changes are coming, what those changes are, and as soon as we know, I think the community needs to know. And I also think that they'll give us grace if they do know. It's going to be tough. But.
So two things. One, to address the example of the student nurses. So I've been saying this for 4 years, and almost every opportunity when I talk about the ESSER cliff, do you remember the slide? I always use the nurse contract as an example because prior to COVID, our nursing contract was $1.4 million. And we contract for the public's edification. All our nurses are staffed, are employed by the city of Cincinnati, and we contract with the city of Cincinnati, the health department. So prior to COVID, it was $1.4 million. When the student wellness grant from Governor DeWine came out, it increased because we received some student wellness money, increased it to $1.7 million. During COVID, it is now $8 million a year. We cannot sustain, because we were trying to put a nurse in every building because of our health concerns. We can't sustain that. So we're going to have to figure out how that's going to come back to the general fund next year, 25. We need to figure out if we want to keep a nurse in every building, which we haven't been able to fill, but and we want to keep a nurse in every building. What are we going to cut out? That's $8 million worth of dollars to do that, right? Well, it's just a matter of spending priorities. The second thing is to answer that public. I can't believe I didn't think of this first. The current year general operating budget is $613 million. Next year's is the target is $570 million. And the reason there's such a big change is because we're going back to a balanced budget. During COVID and because of last year, bringing a new superintendent that was basically at the very end of the budget cycle, we let the budget grow larger than our revenue cycle for that year for a specific reason, with an agreement that we would go back to balancing our budgets based on our revenue. So based on our forecasted revenue, and that's, if you recall, it's driven by the state foundation formula and our property tax revenues. Property taxes do not grow with enrollment. They're based on property valuation. So for every new child, that property tax dollar gets spread a little bit thinner. And then the state foundation formula is not fully funded. So even though the formula in philosophy is a great formula, haven't fully funded. And there's some inherent weaknesses still in the formula that we're dealing with. But so from day one, we're looking at reducing our spend. We can't continue to spend everything next year that we're spending this year. We have to make some choices.
Just to add, if I can, kind of lobby on that idea of trying to organize ourselves better, because when you're going to have that much of a drop of expenditure, obviously we need to get the return on investment that you all have been working on and thinking about. We also have to, I would assume, get rid of redundancies where we have them, obviously. But I think unless we reorganize ourselves, the cuts would be too great necessarily to be able for us to keep moving ahead. So I think that's all part of that, maximizing the use of facilities, maximizing the staffing as we possibly can throughout, and also finding ways to address some of the complications of transportation and health and what have you. So I think that we need to maybe we need to spend a little bit more time on that part of it. I know we are, but maybe go deeper on that issue.
So this right now, the schools are feeling the pain of change financially. The central office is getting ready to feel a very large pain change because we're going to zero-based budget, which means they start their budget with nothing. They have to justify every dollar they're asking for. And that is a far cry from the way they've done things in the past. I had just had a conversation today with our chief operating officer and the conversations he's having with his staff and how hard it is for them to think of it that way. And so it's going to be a challenge this year's cycle of change to go to exactly what you're saying about putting, and what superintendent is saying about we can only spend money on that's driving the largest change towards outcomes, whether it's a business, financial, or outcome that we need, or an academic outcome that we need. We have to drive improvement.
I think I would also add that as we, continue to look at our process, that we align how soon is soon enough to begin to have overall conversations. The treasurer shared the timeline that we've discussed in the past with the board and with the finance committee, which has also been, as I understand, the timeline that's been used fairly consistently for how the information has rolled out. There are just many things when we start thinking through the budget and how we're looking at that. We can talk about what we intend to do, what we intend to recommend, but I don't know if we have a lot of areas that we can be as finite on as we know we have an issue with everything that's funded in ESSER. Because everything that's funded in ESSER is a challenge. And because if it's not funded in ESSER, it has to be funded somewhere else where other things are already being funded. And so there are just decisions that we have to look at and make those decisions around that. So I think that gives us some challenge when it comes to that lead time that we have by being able to discuss, like the example of the nurses, when we're looking at other things that are happening at schools.
How about, do we have any questions for the public? From the public anymore?
No. I have a list of some questions, though, that I might
Go
help
ahead.
the public.
We'd be happy to answer them.
Got to be honest. Does funding follow the child from one CPS school to another CPS school? What about coming from another district to CPS? And how does this affect the budget?
So the answer to the first question, does the funding follow the child? Sort of. When we're building the budget, it's based on the children that we anticipate being in a school at any given school at the beginning of the school year. So that part of the answer is yes. But as the year progresses and that child moves within the district, we don't necessarily pull the teacher. We can't pull the funding because we still have to leave the teacher there for the other 19 children in the classroom. So it's a little bit more challenging in that respect. The state and federal funding is easier to follow because it's more specific to a student's need. When children come from the other district, so we have a program for open enrollment, so students could transfer in between districts. And it used to be they would fund it based on the cost of doing business in that district. But now the state funding formula, we just count those children as our children, and they're funded use the formula. The difference is the wealth factor of each district. So if the child is coming from a not as wealthy district as we're considered to be a very wealthy district, we get a smaller per pupil funding from the state versus a district that has less wealth factor, they'll get more funding from the state. So they try to follow, they've ruled this formula unconstitutional 4 times. They still haven't gotten it completely right. They're working on it. Good question, though.
Let me ask you a question, because I understand, but I don't. So if the budgets at a school, they're all individual, but then you have classrooms that are based on per pupil funding. So if it's like, let's say we're going up to 30 in a classroom, and then let's say 5 of those students leave but go to another school,
right,
where that increases their numbers.
Right.
How does that impact that school, for the school that they left and the school that they're coming to?
So the school that they left, there is no impact because I can't cut 5 children's salary pieces from one teacher. Right. So when they show up at another school in the same place and that causes us to have to hire another teacher, then we take it out of what's called a contingency budget for that very reason. So when we first started student-based budgeting, that was the reason why it wasn't successful, is because of the mobility within the district. So some schools start small in the fall and they grow kids all year long. So we're constantly adding teachers and resources to that school. Some schools start high and then they don't take, like our magnet schools, they don't take kids throughout the year because it's an application process. We don't pool those resources because we can't. We still have students left in the classroom that need that teacher. They don't leave in pockets of 25, so it in practice, in day-to-day practice, is very, very difficult to manage.
So where does the contingency budgeting come from? General fund?
It's a general fund and it's a centralized budget. We typically in the last years have used about $2 million that we set aside, and it's a contingency budget, and it's used for things that show up that we hadn't anticipated. But mostly it's used for enrollment and staffing driven changes.
And when is the state's final count? So I know we talked about budgets really aren't finalized when school starts because there is that contingency piece. There is that hey, we know that there's going to be some kids coming after Labor Day. We know that there are going to be some kids coming after
Right.
the start of the year. When does the state do their count to pay us?
So it's a constant thing now with the new state formula. The base formula is based on the last 3 years, the higher of the last 3 years. But the categorical is based on the current counts. The categorical being students with disabilities, English language learners, economically disadvantaged, gifted, career tech. I'm looking at Kevin if I miss anything. I think that's it. And so Kevin and Kim just went to a seminar today to learn about changes, possible changes in the new formula. So I'm anxious to hear the results of that. But so, the formula has changed. I think I've lived under 5 or 6 different formulas. It changes almost every 2 years.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to constantly adapt to that.
I'll also add, in terms of thinking about just the year-to-year time and stabilizing schools, because we do have to have a time that we stabilize, schools in terms of movement. So we give in the spring, we give the budget based on what we project for the fall, and that means the number of students that would show up in the fall. We take as much information, as much historical information as we can. Schools like, okay, were there additional students that were added? Is it where in a particular grade level or at a particular school you see more of an increase even though now it's less? So when we talk about the appeals process, we're taking those things into consideration as a part of the appeals process. So one of them is historically what's happened in the school. The other is what kind of programming that's in the school right now, so that if we had to move a teacher, how that would be impacted. This is relevant because when students show up in August, after about the first 3 weeks or so, we give 3 to 4 weeks to still allow students to come in. We then go through a TAC process. That's a part of what we do in collaboration with the collective bargaining agreement. And at that point, we're then really looking at, okay, these are the guidelines. This is what's in the formula. This is what's actually in the building. And this is how we need to make changes based on that, because the positions that are in the building may or may not be justified. So for example, this year we had 24 positions that were not justified based on the number of students, but after we went through the appeals process, looked at other information for the school, we said to the schools, we're going to leave these positions for the rest of the year using that contingency. We're going to leave these for the rest of the year. But if you don't qualify for these positions by the time we get to the spring budget, we cannot just continue to move the positions forward. And that's a constant conversation. Unfortunately, the second part of that conversation is the part sometimes that we have to go back and do reminders on, because everyone is comfortable when we leave the positions. And there are many, many reasons why we would do that. But in some instances, we couldn't leave positions because you had other schools that also had need because they had increased. So it's an opportunity to right size as much as you can. Now we're getting to the actual process for this upcoming year, and we have to address in some of those instances these positions that we left last year that really should have been gone, but we left them trying to give us an opportunity to get through the year, give opportunity to do additional recruitment, give opportunity to see if we were going to get additional students to enroll. And now it's not only, now it appears that it's impacting them more exponentially when it really should have been an impact for the fall.
And that's right. Remember when I started this thing by saying this is really kind of a journey. So it's not a one and done thing. So in the spring, once the lottery and the applications, signups, 9th grade, and then the magnet applications, we'll look to see, did something blossom that we didn't anticipate? And so we'll make adjustments there. Over the summer, we'll review, like, did 50 extra kindergartners shown up over at Sailor Park? Do we need to add another teacher? We don't necessarily wait until September. We do monitor the changes in applications and enrollment so that we can pivot quickly and have staffing in place when the students show up. So, but you have to start somewhere. and the projections is the most efficient and most accurate way to start.
Real quickly, on an annual basis, how many people do Cincinnati Public Schools hire as teachers on an annual basis? About 375. So, you know, and that's so precious at this point in time, as everyone knows, with, you know, a number of people leaving the career and maybe many not joining up as they once did. It's a precious resource. And so we're very happy that we can actually say in the last, for my 16 years, we have not had a major reduction in force ever. So in the 16 years, never had that. There's very few urban districts that can actually say that, because we do take great pride and care, we hope, of the number one resource besides our children, which are our staff members.
And if I could just echo right now with even everything that we're looking at, we don't even see the beginning of trying to recommend anything around a reduction in force at all, because we need every teacher that we have, and any other one that we could possibly hire. And so I think that as we're thinking through it, we're really thinking through it, making sure that we are protecting the classrooms as much as possible. Even with some of the recommended changes that we've made, it's really to move teachers into classrooms as well, and not just substitutes. We appreciate our guest teachers. We appreciate having substitutes available to cover classes when teachers are out or they're ill or we have vacancies. But ultimately, our goal is to be 100% staffed. So we have a teacher, a qualified, certified teacher in front of every child. And we believe that we're poised to do that, even if it means making some tweaks in some other areas.
Any more questions from the public?
I think we were going to go on to the Title I presentation right now,
Okay.
due to time, and
Yep.
we can answer any
So
at the
we
end.
talked a lot about it, so I might fly through some of these slides, but we'll give it a whirl. Actually, it's the other PowerPoint, Rob, sorry. You're so good. I want to take a special thank you to Rob, because he's always taken such great
Thanks,
care
Rob.
of us.
Thanks,
Yes,
Rob.
yes. Okay, so flipping to the first slide. So this is a PowerPoint that our grant team and the assistant treasurer did for the principals a week or so ago, while I was out of town at a conference. But so we'll just flip to the next slide. So this is we've already talked about this, the journey of why we left the pool and how difficult it is. So you can go to the next slide. Just to iterate, the purpose of Title I is to improve student outcomes for educationally disadvantaged students. We just have to stay focused on that, and it's supplemental to what the general fund is already doing for every child in our district. Next slide. So this is the part where all the confusion comes in. There was so much misinformation and so many questions and confusion. Everybody's motivations are pure, but everybody's confused about, you know, the 4-year cycle. I've heard people say it's a 4-year average, and last night somebody said it was a 5-year thing. So ODE updates the data annually in June. We use that information. That's what get allocated our funds for the year. Our budgets are all built off of forecasted and projected numbers, so that once ODE gives us our new allocations, we'll readjust, then we'll tweak budgets as necessary. The difference is that, I believe, is the direct certification that the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services uses for, and then so they'll do SNAP, OWE, homelessness, migrant, runaways, and then we add on foster place students. So then there's the paper application process that the OD uses, but that's for the feeding of the children. That doesn't necessarily get updated in the federal grants application. little bit of confusion there, and that's why there's difference in numbers. Now, they do use this weird multiplier. So if I'm a school and have 62.5% free and reduced lunch students, based on this direct certification, they do use a multiplier at 1.6 because they're trying to make up for the people that during COVID or even prior to COVID who didn't want to fill out the paperwork application. So they try to make up for that difference. But that money is fed to CPS, and then that money gets allocated to school buildings based on enrollment. Next slide. So can't read that from here. The point that I wanted to make out here, just a couple one, is that, the regulation that we have to serve 75% or greater for poverty rate, but the district uses 40%. And that's something that we might address for next year, and a change. But that the enrollment, thank you, the enrollment does not include preschool. So those schools that have large preschools in them might see a difference in their allocation. And that we are in year 2 of the 4-year renewal cycle. And we talked about the pre-COVID numbers and then the set aside, the 1% set aside for family engagement. So next slide. Okay, so I'm sorry. So if a school has a poverty rate based on what ODE tells us, that's 40% or greater, they become part of our Title I program. Versus what the federal law says, 75% or above. Okay, that's a district choice, yes. And we've been using that choice for 10 years. Might be time to revisit it for next year. We're using, that's the cycle that we're using. So next slide. So every school has to have what we call a one plan. And actually named this back in the early 90s because every school had all these different grants that they had to do. They had to do a separate spending plan for every one of those grants. And so we just need one plan, right? And that became the one plan. And so those are the rules. I won't read them all to you, but it's specific to the needs of each school driven off of academic results and the test results. Next slide. It has to have a lot of parent engagement. The school-based teams have to develop it. ODE has to review it and approve it. And then there's a requirement for parent notification and family engagement in the planning of the services of those students. Next slide. There's another one they can't read. So priority, they called it priority spending. So the district level has so the schools get their budgets to do what they need to do. The district sets initiatives based on the board's and the superintendent's goals and guardrails, focusing on literacy, and I knew I was going to draw a blank on all of them, but algebra, attendance, graduation, the college thing, thank you. And so what they've done is for grades K to 8, a reading specialist based on some academic results, a math specialist if there's enough funding and with results. And then we actually put in a resource for schools that have more than 20% of English language learners because our ELL population is growing and they need extra support. So we put another body out there to help with the community engagement and school services. And then a 9 to 12, the focusing on reading, attendance, graduation, and again, English language learning. So, so those are the district set-asides, and then they actually place them into the school building budgets. Next slide. This is what's challenging for schools to understand. The money has to be spent in the year of the student. So you can't spend for future money, future students can't spend on old stuff from the prior year. It has to be as evidence-based. It has to be necessary, reasonable, and benefit the students of that year. And so our idea of necessary and reasonable might be different than the federal government's. And so there's a lot of compliance rules that have to follow. So if you go to the next slide. We're always trying to educate our schools because we use site-based management that you always have to have a purchase order in place prior to incurring the expense. There's a lot of confusion. They think if they enter a requisition that's their approval. That is just a request to spend money. The approval and the results of the committee is in the actually fully executed purchase order that has to be in place, or we cannot use federal funds. The general fund has to pay that bill. And so that gets done, as you see a lot in the treasurer's reports, for those then and nows, right? So we're always trying to re-educate allowable and the timing of the spend and what constitutes approval to spend. Next slide. I think I talked about this already. It has to be expended in the fiscal year in which they are awarded. And so at the end of the year, we are allowed to carry some unspent monies over, but it's limited. And eventually they'll make you take the money back or give it back to the federal government. Because if you're not spending it, then you must not need it, right? And so we need to, the grants team every month meets with the budget manager to make sure that, remember the spending goals that we report out every month, to make sure that we are spending on a regular cycle. The tendency in our buildings is to kind of hold on to the funds because they want to run out of money. But then it gets to the point where there's not enough time to spend it all, and you have to spend it on the kids. So you're spending money in May, and it's not really for the current year kids. It's, you're trying to buy stuff for next year, and so that's not allowed. And so that's a challenge that we have every year. And so the next slide actually talks about allowable uses. It has to be for a well-rounded education, instructional supports, some non-instructional supports, and improving school quality. The next slide talks about the restrictions, and this is hard. Food, awards and prizes, gift cards. We can't do gift cards on any funding source. T-shirts and spirit wear cannot be used on Title I. So everybody wants, it's great. Superintendent gave out T-shirts last night. She used her own funds. Schools want to use spirit wear to gain and market the district, and that sounds really great, but you just can't use federal funds to do that. Furniture, not allowed. Homecoming, prom, dances. Furniture is not allowed because that's a general need of the district, so the general operation funds have to do that, right? Homecoming, everybody has homecoming, so that's not supplemental, right? Those kinds of activities and advertising and marketing you can't do. So I remember when COVID hit and everybody wanted to personalize, put their school logos on their masks. The federal funds you can't do it. It's cool, but they just say no. So next slide. The requirements around parent and family engagement. Tracy Stillwell is our expert, and she does a fabulous job. So if there's questions about that, there's a link in this PowerPoint. We'll put the link out about all the allowables uses for the parent engagement, family engagement. Because you can do finger foods when you have a parent meeting, to bring them in. So I think that there's one more last slide there. Let's see. Just to reiterate that Title I is to be used to improve student outcomes for a well-rounded education and enriched educational experiences, engaging the parents and the family on how to do that. And should they give some examples of language? It's too small to read. But in general, that's the purpose of Title I and all the rules that we have to follow. And I'm hoping we cleared up the confusion about how schools qualify for Title I, and the delays and the timing of that based on federal and state rules. Any more questions?
Yes, we have 2 community questions, and I think we can probably do them and wrap them up here.
and the OTs and the PTs and all those related services, in addition to the one-on-one pairs that are driven by IEPs, individual education plans. So I haven't looked at it this year yet because we haven't even started the central office budgets, but we typically run around 8% of central administration, which is in alignment mostly with the national average. So I know there's a lot of confusion about the growth of staff in central office. You know, at some point when I first came into the district, we didn't really have a curriculum department. I think we had one person, and that just didn't work. So we've slowly been trying to beef up our curriculum because our children deserve the best in curriculum, because that's what drives outcomes.
We have no more community questions.
Okay.
We are at
Those are great.
7:02.
So-
Okay.
You do?
Oh, wait, there's one more. Oh.
Our friend from Fairview.
They wanted to ask if they could find the ODE numbers that were referenced. I think they are probably in your Title I presentation, which we can post online.
So I don't have specific school level data in that presentation. We can certainly provide that. We can
Okay.
post it. It's public information.
Absolutely.
Everything I do is public. So,
And I have a question for you, Jen. So I'm looking at the slides. I think it was slide 14. You don't have to bring it up, Rob, but it talked about compliant examples and non-compliant examples. What if a school wants to use specific money for the targeted students within their building? So like, let's say they want extra tutoring services or extra, like even like we gave the prom example, but let's say there are some disadvantaged students that can't do some of the activities. Are they allowed to use the federal funding for that?
yes, tutoring is an allowable service because it's driving student outcomes and it's addressing a specific academic need.
Okay. So when we say like, you know, tutoring requests to support students' academic needs overall isn't under the non-compliant example. But if they were to specify it's for these students, then it does count, right?
So I know a recent example that we had to address was they wanted to pay for security during tutoring services, and that is not allowable because it's not a direct impact to the student.
Okay, thank you. Well, do you have any more questions? I think that we have had we can add this to the list of another successful financial town hall with Just Ask Jen. I love the fact that we've got our finance chair, board member Bolton, our superintendent here joining us as well. And we get great community questions. Our next Just Ask Jen is March
14th.
14th. So make sure, and we're talking about
We're going to try to talk about state and federal, all the state and federal grants, which we were going to do tonight, but we kind of repurposed because of the feedback we were getting. And so we can actually give an update to where we are in the budget at that time in March and talk more specifically about priorities for all the other grants and even give an update on ESSER.
I think that'd be great. So make sure that you tune in. And if you don't know about ESSER, please go back and watch our previous Just Ask Jens, because we spent an hour talking about ESSER. And I have two suggestions. One for the treasurer's office. We need a whiteboard presentation on title funding. I think the whiteboard that you all did the last time was awesome. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go back and watch the video. What was that about? That was about
State funding.
State funding. It was awesome. So that's a suggestion. And then for the public, we need to push the legislators to fully fund the state funding formula. So it's something that you can do. I'd like to leave you with some action items. Please, please, please email, text our legislators and tell them we need the funding formula to be fully funded. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, we talked about that in a previous Just Ask Jen. So check that out as well. Any other last comments from anybody?
I just want to say thank you to everybody that's come to the podium, sent us emails, challenged our thinking, staff, parents, community members, employees, because this is the best involvement and engagement that we've had around the budget in many, many years. So I'm thrilled that people care enough to challenge our thinking. And so I welcome that. We try to be as transparent as we can. It's not always easy to do because of the speed in which we operate, and so it's well intentioned. And then with that, I'll just pass it on to the superintendent. Want any closing comments?
I echo completely what our treasurer has shared tonight. This is definitely a labor of love and one that we work through together. So being partners in this work and being able to work alongside our board as we are collectively making the decisions that are in the best interest of our students, there's no better place to be. So thank you so much. Thank you for this idea to even do this for the community, and having that information and those resources there and available. I think has been great. Thank you.
Board Member Bolton? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, and we will sign off right about now. Have a great night.